Woody Register. I have known of him since 2016, almost 8 years. When Deborah Jackson and I,
Can you hear it okay?
I don't know if you remember this moment, but you changed my life, my sister. We were on the board at Canuga, and she told me that she was then working at Sewanee. And I said, okay, tell me the good people at Sewanee. I probably did it differently than that, a little more restrained. But she said the first name she mentioned was Woody Register. And I said, why? And then she told me what we're going to talk about today, and that he was the driving dynamic impulse behind the Roberson Center, about which we will hear in a few minutes, and a lot of transformation going on at the University of the South, Sewanee. I got in touch with him soon thereafter because I had the first experience of flunking retirement the first time. And that was to be the interim rector at St. Luke's at Atlanta. I got in touch with Woody and asked him if we could have 2 video interviews for the Rector's Forum. I think they went viral. You can Google Woody Register.
I haven't heard that.
You can Google Woody Register and Ed Bacon, and you will be enlightened. And then, because it was so intriguing, his story and the story he was telling, I got in touch with the then Vice Chancellor, Admiral Brigady, and he and I had a wonderful go around. And we are going to unveil all of that in this session and next week's session, because Woody has graciously and generously agreed to return next week. Those of you who will come to the sermon after this will hear that I think that story is crucial. And whether or not you're telling a story of fear or of love, and if you're telling a story of fear, no doubt somebody's being hurt by that. Yourself and others. So I called Woody, and now I'm on first day. I called Woody and asked him if we could tell the story that he's here to tell in the context of story. Because from my reading, now this is Ed Bacon, not Woody Register, from my reading, some of the people he, I think, will talk about really had the Jesus story and the Christian story absolutely wrong. And the regents, the Board of Regents, led by and illuminated by our guest speaker today, had a revelatory epiphany that the University of the South was founded on a story that was not Jesus's story. And that there has been a process which will go on of disassociating the university with that story and saying, we ain't gonna have anything to do with that story. And we're gonna go into the repair of that story. Today is to talk about the process of the story, the realization, the truth telling about the story, and how the regents came to their very inspiring documents that they signed. Next Sunday, we'll talk about the whole issue of repair. So, without further ado, I want y'all to give the warmest possible welcome to my friend, teacher, and inspirer, Woody Register.
think if I even open my mouth, I'm going to ruin my reputation. Hard to live up to that, but thank you, Ed.
You're very welcome, my friend. So, will you just tell us the story of, he's a history professor in the university, and what led you, a wonderful, law-abiding, God-loving history professor, to unveil the story, and how you did it, and how you brought people in. And I'm not going to talk much. No.
Okay, I'll try to tell that story. First of all, thank you all for coming this morning. I have a feeling when he says come, y'all come. And so thank you for responding to Ed's invitation. It's good to be, we've never met in person until this morning. I didn't realize he was taller than I am. So.
At least you didn't say more obese than I. That was one very generous of you.
Never occurred to me. I also didn't know I was going to know a lot of people in the chairs here this morning, and I think it would have been a lot more nervous driving down than I was. So, but it's good to see many old friends, former students, if you can believe that, former colleagues that I've had. And of course, Murdoch was the first one to reach out to me. Murdoch and I worked closely together with the Roberson Project when he was a student at the School of Theology. So this is a reunion homecoming for me in a way. And last thing I'll say is I've always wanted to go inside this church, and because it's, in my mind, it's a very curious architecture. So thank you for this invitation. You know, I was not destined to be sitting here this morning, either personally or professionally. Some of you may know, I'm in training as a historian. I'm mostly am interested in the post-Civil War history and not the post-Civil War South. I've spent all of my major research time, which accumulates into years now in New York State. So this interest and research I've done on in the Civil War era, pre and Civil War era South, and then afterward, was always an interest, but it was not it's not what I was hired to teach. But several years ago, about 2006, I got involved by accident again in working on a big project. Sewanee was approaching its sesquicentennial, and there was going to be a book of essays published about that. And kind of out of the last minute, in an act of desperation, they asked me to contribute something to it. So even that was an accident. And but that assignment caused me to go back into the primary record of the university, which I thought I knew pretty well, but rapidly discovered that I did not. And from that step to another got me moving in this direction. And one more thing happened. And I don't often tell this story. Sewanee built a new science building about 15 years ago, called Spencer Hall. Very nice building. And to raise money for its construction, they solicited, approached people and told them that they could be, recognized in any number of ways. Names in the floor, names in the ceiling, names on the doors. But one of the offices on the second floor, which was a colleague in chemistry, that was his office. The family that had given the money wanted the university to honor, I guess, their grandfather, who had been students in the 1930s. And so the office had a big plate glass windows, new style office, no privacy. And etched into the glass was, in memory of the gold dust twins. And then the next man who escaped right at this point. And so that was there for everyone who looked to see. I don't know if you know who the gold dust twins were or are. Well, in the late 19th century, the Fairbanks Soap Company had a brand of soap called the name, and the logo included this racist caricature of two black infants or toddlers that were called the Gold Dust Twins. And the point of this was that the soap worked so well, it will turn anything white for these two children. If you can find it immediately on a Google search of Gold Dust Twins. And so I saw that and I thought, whose good idea was this? And why didn't anybody know this? Well, you know, I'm a nerdy historian, so I know about this, but no one else did. And I brought it to the attention of the provost, and we went over and looked at it and talked about it. And ultimately, the window went to the office. Kind of quietly, no big fuss. But that incident became kind of emblematic, I thought, of an attitude at Solani that was very enthusiastic in trumpeting its history and celebrating its history, and you know, and venerating the bishops. Some of them are in your fellowship hall down here, their portraits, and giving them the credit for founding the university and, you know, and its subsequent contributions to American law. So there's that enthusiasm about our history, but at the same time, we were, I thought, severely underinformed about the history of the 19th century and where these things that we did very casually and naively, perhaps, had a much more troubling history than many people realize. So that didn't send me on a campaign to do what I'm doing, but it did make me put the work that I was doing. I mean, you may know this. I wrote an essay about the infamous 1899 football team. That's the one who won 5 games in 7 days. My investigation of that put me into the center of the history of race, of whiteness and of blackness and so on. And then this window, and then everything else. So all of these things came together and sent me to the original, the earliest documents of the founding of the university. And my idea was that prior to doing any investigation, it's the basic one about the founding of the university, that it was started to train priests and planters' sons right before the Civil War. The Civil War intervenes. The funds that were raised disappeared, and then it struggled for it and beginning again in 1868, etc. But so the story I always told is because we were rescued. We were, we slipped out without being deeply implicated in slavery. When I went back to the original documents, which, by the way, we are now converted to electronic form so anyone can see. We should have done this long ago, but we're finally getting to it. Slavery moved from something that we had dodged to really be the explanation, the reason, the justification at the center of founding the university. And this was something that I don't know whether I was resistant to know or just didn't know. And so simultaneously with this changing of my mind and finding the university's history actually a lot more interesting than I thought it would have been. Was the massacre in 2015 in Charleston at another Emmanuel church. If you know anything about Sewanee, a lot of people at Sewanee have, come from South Carolina, especially the local. And at the time, John McCardle was our vice chancellor, and he has a home in Beaufort, South Carolina, which is 40 or so miles from Charleston in the Low Country. And so John and many other Sewanee people in that region had deep connections to the people who were harmed in that terrible murderous incident. So at the same time, John and the then provost John Swallow were thinking that Sewanee, the controversy arose and then resolved about the Confederate flag at the South Carolina State House. John became concerned about how honest we were about our own history. And that's when they started putting the screws on me because of these conversations I had with John Swallow about that offensive racist window. And I protested that I was not the first. I'm interested in early 20th century, many other subjects, but not this. But they persuaded me that I should be the one to start. And so I began planning it in 2016. But I wanted to emphasize that it was my own awakening that had occurred first, and I still didn't identify it as something that I needed to do much about. So I give them the credit or the fault, as the case may be, for encouraging me in this direction. And it's changed my life. It's changed my scholarship. It's put me out in situations like this, which someone asked me last night, did you ever think you were going to be in Episcopal churches all the time? And I said, no. I mean, I'm in Episcopal churches all the time. And this shows something about what's happening among Episcopal churches too. But it's changed my life in other ways. It's introduced me to people. It's connected me. I have invaluable friendships with people in Sewanee and in other places whom I never would have met. So it has not made me rich, but it has enriched me. It's made me a better person, and I think a better scholar and a better historian for being a historian. So that's how, in a way, how I crossed paths with Ed, Deborah, and many others. And I'm grateful to all of the people who knocked some sense into me and said that you may not think this is your work to do, but that you can do it. So I'm not sure if that was where the question was headed, but no, it's perfect.
Perfect. So you had this realization after the angel Gabriel came and told you.
My good ear.
That you had another calling that was different than many of us in this room have had those experiences. So now tell the story, if you don't mind, about how you got from that moment to that day when the regents voted to sign that document that is so telling. And in there, please tell the story, which is so chilling to me, of discovering sermons written by slaveholding bishops justifying that this was God's way.
Yeah. So in 2016, late 2016, I put together a proposal for what's now called the Robeson Project. So we can say that it started around November, December, 8 years ago. And then we officially launched in July of 2017. And then the statement, you mentioned, the statement by the governing board, the board of regents, and so on, is in the early fall of 2020. How did we get there? Well, I mean, part of it is the research we were doing, and the new kind of narrative that we were trying to tell, and it was one that upset people. I mean, it upsets a lot of people still today. But then I think the critical catalyst, the critical agent that set these forces moving in a way that I was not prepared for, I didn't think it would happen, was Reuben Brigady, who became the vice chancellor in the spring of 2020. He came on in the midst of COVID. And he was the one who, working with especially the chair, Nick Bolts, of the Board of Regents at the time, and some others, pushed that forward. But the critical thing for me was that they wanted to be based on the university's history. And so I had about 2 weeks to write up everything in a very condensed thing, basically 2 pages. I think it ended up being 12 dense pages. I still remember it, y'all. Sorry.
It's a great read. Please read it. I printed it out and reread it last night.
Yeah, so it's very brief, but the basis of it was this assertion that I made, argument that I made, that you can't understand the founding of the University of the South without understanding the significance, the central role of slavery. The 3 bishops who are always credited, including one whose portrait, Bishop Odie, whose portrait's in your fellowship hall, were all pro-slavery Christians. People constantly say to me, well, you know, yes, they were themselves enslavers. They enslaved human beings as property. Yes, they did that, but that was not all there was to them. They were many other things as well. And true, they did many other things as well. But for each of them, being a master of men, you know, the master of their household, the master of their family, the master of their servants, was critical to how they understood themselves. It was a central aspect of their identity. And so I say to people, well, yes, they did other things, but you can't divide people into parts. They're a whole. That whole may be a little disintegrated, but they're a whole. And for each of these men, and especially for Bishop Stephen Elliott of Georgia, and Bishop Leonidas Polk of Louisiana, who really are the 2 most important driving figures in founding the university, they were both evangelical pro-slavery Christians. They believed that, I mean, Ed mentioned sermons. I brought part of one today. This is called Our Cause in Harmony with the Purposes of God in Christ Jesus. And this is a sermon that Eliot gave in Savannah in 1862, shortly after some Confederate victories, Manassas or Bull Run, whichever you prefer. And Eliot in this said, you know, that slavery was, as he put it, one of our most sacred domestic relations, and critical to understanding why, not just why the Confederate military forces prevailed in some critical battles at that time, but to understanding why God was on the side of the Confederacy. This was the most sacred call, as he understood it, for why the Confederacy was a sacred cause. That is, that all of history, and Eliot has this sweeping view of the history of the last 150, well, 250 years, I guess, at that point, that that Africans had been placed into the care of white people for a reason, to raise them out of their savagery, to bring them into the light of true religion, and then, as he thought, to make them instruments of evangelical instruments, because white men can't stand the climate in Africa. So what do? You Christianize the Africans, and then you send them back as evangelicals, and then they bring the continent. They can stand the heat of Africa. They can bring the continent into the light of true religion. And then what does that do? It hastens the return of Jesus. As the world becomes Christian, Christ, that prepares for Christ's return. And Eliot had been swept up by, he was a convert in the Second Great Awakening, which did in fact affect Episcopalians at the time. So, so this was part of his cosmic religious worldview. And so when they were fighting for slavery, they were not fighting out of material interests. In fact, those material interests, as he put it, cotton was God's gift. Cotton was God's instrument for expanding slavery. How do you understand how the United States went from 800,000 enslaved in the early 18th century, the 19th century, at the time of the outlawing of the international slave trade in the United States? How did it go from 800,000 to 4 million? That's God's plan, right? And all of these people who are criticizing us, they're the ones who have it wrong. Read the Bible, he says. You will see that we are the nation, God's nation that is doing God's work. And so, and Polk believed this as well. When Polk went to, just read you a little quotation here, and then I'll get back to the main story. When Polk, as you may know, Bishop Polk, Bishop of Louisiana, was a graduate of West Point, had never really served in the military, but Jefferson Davis brought him on as a low-ranking general early in 1861, or the summer of 1861. And so Polk said, I'm not going to stop being the bishop. I'm just going to strap my sword over my gown. You may have seen this metaphor about Polk as the Christian martyr for the Confederacy, that he strapped his sword over his gown. He didn't resign from his bishop's position. And that was controversial. It was controversial at Sewanee for several generations, but that's another story. So when he explained why he accepted this commission and did not resign from the bishop's seat, he said, I know that very well, and I do not intend to resign it. He said, on the contrary, I shall only prove the more faithful to it by doing, that is, to my bishop's duties, by doing all that in me lies to bring this unhallowed and unnatural war to a speedy and happy close. You may know this about Polk, that people today say that the cannonball that killed him in Pine Mountain, Georgia in 1864 was the single greatest blow to the Union cause, because they killed the worst general in the Confederate Army. I don't make light of it, but they do actually. People at West Point say that, who know this history much better than I do. But anyway, so he's going to serve in the Confederate military forces. He says, we of the Confederate States are the last bulwarks of civil and religious liberty. We fight for our hearthstones and our altars. This is a very common rhetoric at the time. You're fighting for your hearthstones and your altars, home and church. Everyone said that, and it was fighting for the Confederacy. But this is what he adds. He says, above all, that is, more important than anything else, above all, we fight for a race that has been by divine providence entrusted to our most sacred keeping. So when I accept a commission, I not only perform the duties of a good citizen, but contend for the principles which lie at the foundation of my social, political, and religious policy. So above all, we fight for those people we serve. That's the first cause. And so whenever someone says, well, the Civil War wasn't really about slavery, I say, well, how do you deal with General Bishop Pope? And many others, Eliot, I could quote him all morning and beyond on this very same topic. This is why we fight. So when I read passages like this, and you didn't have to convince me that slavery is the central cause of the Civil War, but to read them in the coming from the mouths of these bishops, and to begin to appreciate even more how this pro-slavery Christianity was at the heart of founding the university. The university was founded to be a beacon to the world, that a slave-owning people were progressive, modern, virtuous, but also, and most importantly, God. They said the world is turning against us. So we're going to create this great university of the South. And that's not, of the sweet tea drinking South. That's not of the, we love fried chicken and Alabama football. I hate Alabama football. But rather the region, as they put it, of the plantation states. So they did this to preserve, but also to perpetuate, promote, expand slavery. And the model of the university that they proposed would have been the most modern university in the world within that time. Not just to train priests, but to train engineers, train scientists, to train a new generation of scientific agriculture. And also, one of the schools that they were planning to establish was a school of race science. So that create a scientific knowledge base for understanding why there are masters and there are slaves in the world. This was the original vision. So then you begin to reckon with what happens to this vision in the generations after emancipation, after 1868. When Swanee really opened the schools for the very first time to his earliest students. And that's when you begin to see how the lost cause, and it's the lost cause, the justification, the veneration of the Confederacy, in a way that sidelines, at best, the role of slavery in the conflict, political and cultural. How the lost cause became central to Swanee's understanding of its mission and of its obligations to the inferior race of the South. So it becomes the foundation of its own version of white supremacy. And the university leaders, bishops, I'm going to Bishop Gaylor, he's portraits in here too, very critical in this. Gaylor became a nationally recognized and even larger voice in the 1920s and 30s on the race problem and the obligations of the superior race to the inferior race. He's a very complicated man, but he was a Christian white supremacist. And he was the chancellor at Swan for almost 30 years. Had a profound effect there. So when we begin to look at this story, right, and the story that we tell, of an institution that can be unqualified, unproblematically proud of its past, there's a kind of disconnection, you might say. We need to investigate the stories we tell, and we need to create a new narrative, one that's more truthful. I don't claim to be absolutely true, but I strive to be as truthful as I can be. And it has to be inclusive. It has to be inclusive of, there were almost 300 people who gave money for the founding of Sewanee in the late 1850s, and they pledged about $1.2 million. That's in 1860 dollars. That would be in the billions today. And those 300 people enslaved more than 40,000 people. That is more than 1% of the enslaved population in the United States at that time. Those 40,000 people are not a footnote in our history. They are an essential agent in our history. They are our legacy founders as much as any bishop, as much as any student, as much as any donor. And then there are many generations of African American people who lived and worked and so on, who cleaned the buildings, cooked the food, took care of the students. For the longest time, well into the 1960s, so maybe some older graduates here, Black men made the beds every day for the students and so on. They enabled them to live like gentlemen. So those people too need to be part of our story. And so that's where we are today. And then this becomes, I think, the basis for the Regent's very important statement in 2020 that we have to be honest and open about our history, its connection with white supremacy, as well as slavery. It doesn't all stop with emancipation. It continues in a different vein. There are continuities and discontinuities. And that we pledge, ourselves to a future, a different future. And so we're still in that process, still figuring that out. There are things happening today that are part of that reckoning process and deciding who gets included in the story of this universe. So that's kind of where we are today.
Perfect. So next Sunday, we're going to get into the Reckoning with Mayor chapter on this unfolding story. But before I open it for questions, there are just two more beats I'd like for you to sound, having to do with the recognition, even before we start talking about reckoning with Mayor. The one thing that I do want you to go back and say about these bishops, I've forgotten which one, I think it was Odie, in Baden-Powell, who was this super fundraiser. And I'm always paying attention to letters from leaders asking people to pledge. So y'all go back in history and look at my letter to y'all and see where it fell short of Jesus. But this was a particularly effective fundraiser. And I'd like you to talk about that person. And then, so they don't take more time asking you the second beat, I would love for you before next Sunday, just to talk a little bit about 2020 and what happened vis-a-vis the impact of this amazing document, which I hope you will go and read on the website.